Hello, everyone. Welcome to Global Express, where we look at developments in our neighborhood and beyond that impact India. This week, we take a look at a series of interconnected events that began with Prime Minister Narendra Modi's trip to Moscow and Russian President Vladimir Putin's bear hug. It has strained India-US ties. Delhi's phalanx of apologists won't hear a single word of criticism for the high-profile visit. They are describing it as a bilateral visit with India's most trusted ally. They're saying India is sending a message to the West that it is in a geopolitical sweet spot, that India believes in pursuing multipolarity, that ties with Russia do not come at the expense of ties with Washington or the West, that India will pursue its policy of strategic autonomy, choose its friends according to its national interests, but there's no going back on the fact that it's rattled Washington. So the three big questions: can the flurry of statements from the United States, State Department, and private calls from Washington by the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, from the Deputy NSA Kurt Campbell to Indian officials be dismissed as nothing? Should we take what the US ambassador to India, Eric Garcetti, said more seriously? He's warned against India taking the India-US relationship for granted. He said there is no such thing as strategic autonomy during times of conflict. And after the comment from an outraged Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky on India fraternizing with President Putin, whom he called a bloody criminal on the day that Moscow bombed a children's hospital in Kiev, on the day that NATO leaders from across Europe were converging on Washington to celebrate 75 years of NATO, and have for the very first time officially denounced China's support for Russia, where does India stand? Do we even qualify for the role of mediator to get Moscow to end the war, as a Pentagon spokesperson has now said? Could India be a trusted interlocutor? I mean, we didn't get any brownie points for our refusal to sign on the declaration at the Switzerland Peace Summit, which said Ukraine's territorial integrity must form the base for any peace process. And of course, how do you tackle the dragon in the room, China, which NATO has finally called out for its support and backing of Russia? Let me turn to our guest today. Talking to us today are Ambassador Katie Fabian, who's served in Europe and the Middle East, in Austria and Italy, and the latest entrance to NATO in Finland too. The two high points of his career were seeing the Iranian Revolution firsthand, and of course, overseeing the evacuation of over 176,000 Indians from the Gulf when Iraqi President Saddam Hussein, another close friend of India's, invaded Kuwait in August 1990. Welcome, Master Fabian. We also have with us Maya Mirchandani, former foreign affairs editor with NDTV. She's reported from across the world on India's foreign policy, filing reports firsthand from conflict zones. She's a byword on Kashmir. She's won numerous awards, turned mentor and teacher, senior fellow at the Observer Research Foundation, and head of the Department of Media Studies at Ashoka University. Her clarity of thought is exceptional. Welcome, Maya Mirchandani.
Thank you, Nina.
And last but not least, Anushka Saxena, research analyst with Takshashila Institution's Indo-Pacific Studies program. Her research on India's foreign policy focuses on the Chinese military and security apparatus, and it's widely read. As is the weekly newsletter that she curates called Eye on China. Welcome, Anushka Saxena.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Gupta.
Let's start with you, Ambassador Fabian. Do you believe that Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit to Moscow could have been timed better? Or was there no choice? Mr. Modi did say he had met Mr. Putin, President Putin now 17 times, that this was an annual bilateral meet. But given that the European leaders and NATO countries were all gathering in Washington virtually on the same time, on June 9 to 11, to mark the Atlantic Alliance's 75th anniversary, and the focus was on how to bring NATO, and Ukraine closer, possibly by giving Ukraine some kind of membership in the future. I mean, nobody had the better optics than Vladimir Putin. So, and he was showing the world that he wasn't isolated, that he still has friends, a friend in India. What do you have to say, Ambassador?
Thank you, Nina. Glad to get into the Global Express.
Thank you.
It's like this. Timing naturally is decided by consensus. So it is possible, I'm only guessing, it is possible that Moscow wanted these dates. But that apart, let us look at the substance. Now, United States believed, mark my past tense, till some time back that it could put diplomatic pressure on India and change its policy towards Ukraine and towards Moscow. But some point of time, United States discovered that it was not working. Now, you mentioned about Ambassador Garcetti's statements. India should not take Indo-US relations for granted, and he said there is no question of strategic autonomy when there is a war. Well, all that I would say is that what Ambassador said about strategic autonomy goes against centuries of European history. Was not Switzerland neutral? Was not Belgium neutral for a long time? And Austria since 1955? So, to say that there is no strategic autonomy when there is a war, well, I'm afraid I find it slightly difficult to understand. But the basic point is they have tried through private, confidential, diplomatic consultations, and they did not get what they wanted. They are putting a little pressure in public, but I don't think it's going to work. And the sooner they realize it, the better for Indo-US relations.
Ambassador Fabian, that is an interesting point of view. But India, it still looks as if it's in the doghouse. Maya Mirchandani, do you agree with that sort of call that is being made that, that India has stepped across several, has stepped on several feet by going to Moscow and making such a big deal of President Putin, and especially on a day when the children's hospital in Ukraine was bombed. Do you think India should have waited, maybe for Kazan, the BRICS summit in Kazan in Russia in October, where it wouldn't have raised as many eyebrows, and shouldn't have handled things a little more subtly? Do you see that and do you see any repercussions coming India's way, or does the US need India as much as India needs the US?
Thanks, Nina, for having me on your show. I think Ambassador Fabian is right, possibly when he suspects that the dates were probably proposed by Moscow. Yes, we have an annual bilateral meeting, but there was nothing to indicate that meeting needs to take place in June. It's taken place in November. It's taken place in January. It's taken place at different times of the year ever since this relationship has been solidified in this framework. Now, the question really is that I think with the Ukraine war, we are seeing, in a sense, a resurgence of Cold War dynamics between the West and Russia. That, to me, indicates that what I guess Prime Minister Nehru's idea of non-alignment was at the time of the Cold War is what India has refashioned as strategic autonomy. But the patience for that kind of sitting on the fence, essentially, seems to be wearing thin. Now, we have seen ever since the Russian invasion of Ukraine first occurred, India trying to position itself as a neutral party, trying to position itself as a peacemaker. Prime Minister Modi famously said he had the war stopped so that he could evacuate Indians from Ukraine. And even in this visit, one of the priorities for him seems to have been to get the Indians who were deceived into fighting for the Russian side back to India. So, the whole positioning of India vis-a-vis the Ukraine war, I think, is a little blurry, is a little complicated, because while you can make the argument that there has been a history of neutrality in other wars, and there is no compulsion for strategic autonomy to not be autonomous, or to have to take a side in a war. I think Ukraine is positioned. I mean, the war in Ukraine has forced countries to actually take a stand. I mean, India has benefited from this war on an economic level. It has been the middleman on the oil trade globally.
Yeah, we'll come to that. We'll come to that. But I
Yeah.
think the more
So
more interesting
yeah.
is the fact that India is on a tripwire. I mean, this is a very, very it's a balancing act that
Right.
I
So
don't.
just to finish my thought, I mean, basically, I think what we're seeing, the statements from the US, the statements from Zelensky as well,
Yeah,
and the push from Moscow is that while you guys are meeting with NATO in Europe, I'm going to tell you who my friends are, and that's Putin's message. The timing, I don't think, was opportune. I think Prime Minister Modi could have waited, maybe read the tea leaves a little better, because we have in the last 20 years made a conscious attempt to improve our relations with the West. So are we going back
that's
on that
right.
somehow? I think that's the question really to ask, because if the West is forcing us to take a side or expects us to take a side, and we're saying we're not prepared, that too is taking a side.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Eric Garcetti, the American ambassador to India, I mean, he basically told India that strategic autonomy is a bogus statement. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. So, I mean, they are hitting us where it hurts. It's not verbally, at least so far, and basically asking us, I think, to choose sides. It is that's how I feel, but. I mean, Anushka, can I come to you now? Could you give us a point of view on the Ukraine war itself? I mean, how has it turned into a war that is, according to the Western reporters that we read, all the various reportage that is coming out of, major newspapers, is that it's a stalemate and that it's not going Russia's way. But when in fact it seems as if it's the other way around, that it is Ukraine that seems to be paying a huge price in this war that is ongoing between the West's proxy and a Cold War enemy, which seems to have the whole Cold War seems to have been resurrected, and India's reluctance to sign on to that Switzerland agreement, is it being seen in a positive light or a negative light by the European powers, or does it work in India's favor? Because there's a lot of talk now about India's relationship with Russia could be used to sort of bring a halt to the war and the hostilities.
Thank you, Ms. Gopal. I think on the first question with regards to where the war is going at the moment, I think it is in the interest of the media in the West to continue to project the image that the war is either a stalemate or it's not going Russia's way. Of course, Russia has suffered significant losses to its weapon systems, tanks. It's faced off against the commitment of the Ukrainian people to continue to fight. 2.5. More than that years into the war, and so in this regard it makes sense that the narrative coming out of the West seems to suggest that the war isn't really going Russia's way or is a stalemate. In fact, coupled with this narrative is the idea that European policymakers have often proposed, which is that the only ideal way for us to conclude the Russia-Ukraine war is to see it end in Ukraine's victory. But from my assessment, the ground reality still suggests that simply because the Russian industrial base is so massive, it has more people, more money, and more weapons to throw at Ukraine. And there are some critically close choke points on the border that. If successfully captured, or if Ukrainian ground forces are defeated in battle there, would significantly impact both the Ukrainian economic and military base and its morale. And Zaporizhia uh, and places like this. Of course, Odessa is a bit far away, but Donetsk and Luhansk, places where Russia has acknowledged the existence of independent people's republics and where Ukraine has lost a lot of its men and money. These are places that
So
Russia.
you see a continuing conflict that is not going to end anytime soon.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's in its third year, and it's most like I would say, and this is something, a survey of 15 European countries that a think tank conducted also seems to agree with, is that the likelihood of Ukraine winning the war is critically low, and from India's perspective, the ideal situation would be to continue to invest in the diplomatic and negotiation effort to reach a more conclusive stalemate. But yes, and yeah, so in that regard, Russia has made some significant advances which cannot be discounted, and the results of the war being in Ukraine's favor or being a stalemate, I would not personally agree with, because not only is the war ongoing, Ukraine has suffered massive economic and military defeats, which could turn the war against its favor.
Yeah.
But this brings brings us to the second part of the question which you asked, which was about India not signing on the peace summit, the Ukraine peace summit document. And I think I have to agree with both Mr. Fabian and Ms. Neechandani that India had no obligation to associate itself with the communique. Many other countries like Indonesia, Latvia, Libya, Vatican didn't associate
Didn't
themselves with the
sign.
communique because there is strategic autonomy in war. And if Modi gave a beer hug to Putin, Biden gave a beer hug to Netanyahu, right? And these are choices we make in war because
Yes.
they show they're highly symbolic. And we our basic goal was to have both Russia and Ukraine on the table. We didn't have Russia on the table. There is announcement of a second summit which Putin has already said he's not going to
Rejected.
participate in. And so if the goal is to conduct diplomacy well, Russian representatives have to be on the table, and that's the kind of
Yeah.
process India will most likely endorse.
So if I can just bring in the ambassador again, Putin himself has talked about, openly about how he talked to Modi about Ukraine. What do you think that conversation would have been about, ambassador? I mean, would he have actually suggested any formulaic kind of steps forward? I mean, any kind of meeting that would not be out in the open, or because I mean, Russia, the contacts between Russia and the West have always been there, right through the Cold War, right through Georgia, right through every conflict that has been there. Do you think that's still active?
Well, before that, answering that question, whether these contacts are active or not, and I personally think they are active, and there is not much scope for India or any other country to intervene and be a mediator. But let's go to a fundamental point. What is India being accused of? Is India sending weapons to Russia? No. Is India coming out with diplomatic statements supporting, mark my word, supporting Russia's aggression? No. And more substantively, this war occurred, of course, on the face of it, when on the 24th of February 2022, President Putin sent in his forces across the border. Though I should emphasize that Russian forces were there within the territorial limits of Ukraine since 2014, and for that too there are reasons. Now, this war occurred primarily because of three men: Putin, Zelensky, and Biden. Biden's
Okay.
contribution is that he walked out of classical diplomacy. December 2021, Putin wanted security guarantees. He sent out draft treaties. Biden publicly rejected them. This is what I
Oh,
call a vicious sort of variation of public diplomacy. Okay? And Zelensky, he chased the mirage of NATO membership. And Biden should have told him there was no question of his getting it. You see? So that is the fundamental basis of this war. And I don't think India had any obligation to join this war on the part of with the West. Now, having said that, I believe that contacts between Russia and the West, especially with Washington, are very much alive. And when these three men, when they want, agree, the war can end. But even if
Oh,
two of them, that is Putin and the American president, whether it is Biden or Kamala Harris or a little later Trump, if these two agree, the war will end. And one more point, Ukraine has lost badly, is losing badly. It is not exactly a stalemate. The country is in terrible trouble, and Russia too has lost a lot. President Biden said Russia has lost 350,000, just one of his speeches. Well, we have to cross-check that, but Russia also has suffered in terms of people getting killed. But the Russian economy has not been washed away as President Biden hoped and continued to hope for a long time. No, he should be told. Russian economy, despite all the setbacks, is doing fairly well.
that's very interesting. That is a good point. So obviously the conversation between Putin and Modi must have been about looking at the future. It couldn't have been just looking at, not just India, Russia, but also about Ukraine. Is it a worry at all, Maya Milchandani, that at the NATO summit, the conclusion of the NATO summit, the major conversation was about the number of Patriot missiles that were going to be dispatched by Germany and so on and so forth, and various other countries to Ukraine, and the fact that that there was going to be some kind of a bridge that was going to be built that would bring Ukraine into NATO, which would then expand NATO even further. And I'm sure this is a red line that Putin would find unacceptable.
I want to answer your question in two parts. I'll get to the Germany bit in just a minute. But, going back to what Ambassador Fabian said, I do agree that India is not under any obligation to take a side in this war. To that extent, because the West is looking at it through strategic interests, the expansion of NATO, the Americans have gone back into a great power rivalry kind of mindset. Their foreign policy mindset is driven. Firstly, the Americans have a psychological, I guess, an image of themselves. Their psyche is that of, a dominant nation. They went from the Cold War and a bipolar era to a unipolar era. The multilateralism that followed and the multipolarity that followed hasn't worked out for the Americans well. And the second part of that is that the Americans themselves, there is bipartisan support at the domestic level on the Russia policy. And this is fundamentally for two reasons. One is because the 2016 US election, the deliberate misinformation campaigns that were driven by Russia to ensure a Trump win in the White House have really pushed the Democrats against the wall. That's one part of it. And the second, of course, is the kind of Russian expansionism that has allowed this kind of invasion of Ukraine. So to that extent, I do believe that India is sort of doing well to stay out of this kind of taking sides. Where I have a slight difference of opinion is the fact that there is a tremendous humanitarian crisis that has ensued. And I think in the event of a humanitarian crisis, sometimes as drafters of the UN Charter of Human Rights, as aspirants to the Security Council, I think it's incumbent on India to not just sort of speak in platitudes about there must be peace, innocent lives must not be lost. Right. I think we know who's killing and we know who's being killed. So everything else that eliminates the identifiers, to me, is a bit meaningless. So I think there is a slight nuanced difference of view. Now,
so are you saying that India should be more vocal in its criticism?
I think it should be. And I think the optics of having met Putin and given that bear hug on a day when the children's hospital was bombed were bad. Prime Minister Modi did make an attempt to speak about the war. He made a statement about how innocent lives must not be lost. But that was a moment where I think Putin used Prime Minister Modi. Putin has leveraged Prime Minister Modi to say to the world that I can do what I want and I still have friends. And
But
I
I
think
think Prime
it's
Minister
for
Modi
us
has
to,
done the same thing.
well, yes and no. I feel that Prime Minister Modi could have been more forthright on the children's hospital bombing.
Yeah.
He had the opportunity and he did not take it. That's on that. But the German question that you're asking and the issue of Patriot missiles, I think when you look at Germany and Eastern Europe's response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine versus when you look at the American response, it is an existential crisis for the Germans. It is an existential crisis for Eastern European countries. Russia is at their border. The United States is separated by a whole continent and an ocean.
Yeah.
So, I mean, Zeitenwende, that the German chancellor has talked about, the idea that they're going to go back into acquiring weapons and strengthening their army. They've gone from it's a significant shift from their World War II policy, post-World War II policy, right? So they are coming at it from the perspective, I feel, of defense and self-defense. Should they need to deploy this? I don't think, I think we'll have to separate the German response a little bit from this idea that at the NATO summit, they were talking about Patriot missiles, because I think from Germany, the threat is very different, or the threat perception is very different.
That is true. That is
I
true.
don't know if I've answered your question.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with you with what you said. Germany is right there at their doorstep. Russia is at their doorstep, so they face a much bigger threat, than other countries there. Anushka, if I can come to you, much is being said about this, this huge, the document that has been the joint statement that has come out. But reading through it, I didn't find anything truly dramatic. I mean, in the sense, much is being said about India's Russia trade. India's imports from Russia in 2023-24 was about $66 billion, and it's only increased by another 20 billion in the first quarter of 24. So actually, and India's exports to Russia stand below $4 billion. So what is it that binds India to Russia, apart from our oil and gas imports, which have of course done our economy a huge benefits? But what is it that that India gets out of this Russia relationship? I mean, going by the past, yes, we know Kudankulam and they are our major arms supplier, aircraft supplier, and now there's talk of joint production of arms which we can sell. But is it more than that? Is it also because Russia has stood by India time and time again? And India doesn't really know whether it can trust the US. Is that what it is?
Right. Thank you for that, Ms. Gopal. I think, of course, the fact that India and Russia have a robust military and economic partnership, the fact that Russia has been a historical ally for us, all of those are extremely important to us. But these are not new factors that may be influencing our relationship today in some unique manner, and they've existed for a long time, right? But I think. One of the most important things that India gets from maintaining solid ties with Russia is that it has to continue to be a significant player in the Russia-China-India equation. We know for a fact that India's most important strategic threat at this moment is China. We don't know the extent to which India's relationship with both Russia and China is a factor in China-Russia relations, but there is a fear, at least in the analytical community, and I'm sure in the policy community, that any change in the status quo from how the China-Russia relationship is now to maybe Russia becoming what many are referring to as a junior partner to China would not be in India's interests, because that means that the historically neutral position that Russia has taken on issues pertaining to the India-China border may cease to exist. We know for a fact that Russia has expressed support to China in its other military in its kind of use of force narrative when it comes to Taiwan, and has also expressed support over the ownership of islands in the East China Sea vis-a-vis Japan. And so Russia has done all of that for China. But we cannot possibly have that balance of power shift such so radically that it also begins to impact Indian interests. So not only does India find a very important partner in Russia, and of course one must not discount that Russia is indeed, it continues to be a nuclear power, and in that sense Russia's heft and might continues to exist. And so beside that fact, it is also important that India maintain its friendly relations with Russia because of the Russia China relationship. And at this point I would contend that the Russia China relationship is not one where either of the two sides is a junior partner. Like I said, both sides continue to remain nuclear power. And
But
apart from
Anushka, one point I want to make. I mean, there's a lot of talk in that joint statement about, the international north-south trade and transport corridor and, linking cities from St. Petersburg to Mumbai and this Chennai-Vladivostok maritime route, the North Sea route, the Arctic. Are these things that Russia will be actually be able to, materialize? Will India and Russia be able to do it, given the fact that China is such a force to reckon with today?
Right. On the international north-south transport corridor, I would say that INSTC has been a project that's been around for the longest time. I think the first time India and Russia agreed to bring about such an endeavor was in 2015. Subsequently, in 2018 was the first time we saw the two sides use bits of the transport corridor to actually carry freight. And since then, there's nothing in the news that we're hearing about. So effectively, I would like to argue that it's a stalled project, as are maybe other ambitions between bilateral ambitions to maybe have a joint trade route to the Arctic or so on and so forth. And so in that regard, I would say if China continues to become an important partner to Russia to the point where the Russia-China relationship becomes the most significant in Russia's foreign policy basket, we may just see these projects go to waste. Like you said, if China does, if that force to reckon with really becomes a challenge. But at this moment, I think these are deliberative points of actions. You see these things being mentioned in communique after communique across summits of a bilateral nature,
That's
because
right.
it forms the commitment that we're not just invested in this partnership because you give us some significant military advantages or our trade is really booming, but these other factors kind of tell you that we want to explore the length and breadth of our partnership, which is something that is also interestingly mentioned in the India Russia summit document, that they want to explore all possible avenues of cooperation in this multifaceted partnership. Now, I'm not saying this is no limits 2.0, but I am saying that along with these kind of secondary endeavors,
Yeah,
this
that's a good
document
point.
helps me.
So, Ambassador, if I can come to you, I mean, the point we want to also, and I'd also like to, run by you, is that, there's another theory going around that Russia, Iran, and India will be the alternative power nexus, and both Russia and Iran are seen by the West as the so-called bad boys. Do we really want to join that club? Is a question I'd like to ask, because I mean, it does benefit us greatly. And the second point I wanted to make is in there is a talk from people who were at the summit in Moscow that a lot of the angst also comes from the fact that India could provide ammunition, which Russia desperately needs for its for the war with Ukraine. Do you think India will actually do something like that?
Well, um, regarding the first question, let us look at the big picture. Partly, if not mainly, because of America's policy Russia-China axis got stronger and stronger.
Yes.
China recognizes that if Russia goes down, then America will target China. China recognizes that if it wants to do anything with Taiwan, it would need Russia's support significant. So the Russia-China axis got stronger partly, and I will repeat, mainly because of America's wrong policy. Second, you mentioned about China, Russia, and Iran. Again,
Yeah.
there is absolutely no justification for continued sanctions on Iran. As you
Okay.
mentioned, I was there in 76, 79. America's policy towards Iran is wrong. It has been subjugated to Israel's interests. Israel, the recipient of largest American aid, dictates American policy in that region. So there is an axis which brings together Russia, China, and Iran is getting closer to it. Now, is India going to join that? No, there is no question of India's joining it, but India will certainly go ahead with its relation, strengthening its relations with Russia, come what may, because Indian diplomacy can do that tightrope walking. Now, you had a second question about?
I was basically, also interested in the fact that, when India went nuclear, I forgot what the last question was asked, but basically I was also looking at, the fact that Russia has been such a strong support to India through the years. When India went nuclear, it was the only country that provided us with with whatever we needed, enriched uranium and so on and so forth. And to date, our Kudankulam nuclear plants are the ones that are kept going by Russian, nuclearized fuel. And 4 more plants apparently are going to go on, become active very soon. So this is also something which I'm sure needles the West. Space cooperation with Russia. But there are other countries, like now Keir Starmer has become Prime Minister of the UK, and he's very keen, just like his predecessor was, to sign a free trade agreement with India. And even though France has thrown up this very odd triumvirate, jostling for power, France's Emmanuel Macron, the president, has cozied up to Delhi quite actively. So do you feel that Europe, will sort of also not take such a sort of anti-India line as is being talked about? And Maya, please come in as soon as the ambassador goes. I know you have to go too.
Well, I shall be brief. First of all, it is true that America has made certain statements, but I personally do not take them very seriously. And if you
Really?
noticed, Garcetti also said we will raise human rights issues and all that.
Yes, he
All
did.
that they will do, but they also know that it's not going to make much difference. But they have to make they have to make these public statements for their own reasons back home. You see, and as far as India is concerned, India's clout is growing, and as you said, UK. I don't know why Rishi Sunak could not sign that agreement. Probably he was busy otherwise. Of course, it doesn't make any sense to say that it will be
No,
signed
that is the
before
reason.
Diwali
That is
and
the
all that.
reason.
So,
Yeah.
and Macron has, or France under Macron has realized India's geopolitical importance, and also, let me be very frank, India's importance as a big market for weapons purchase. So, India's importance is increasing, and I don't think even America's couple of statements will make much difference.
Yeah, I can. I'm happy to sort of jump in as well, just to add. The fact that India is a fast-growing economy, that Indian markets are attractive to the world, is basically what has ensured that Delhi has been able to make strategic autonomy work as well. Because every other, if realpolitik and national interest guides foreign policy, which it does pretty much across the world, then everyone is in it for themselves for the most part. And I think Ambassador Fabian is absolutely right when he talks about American domestic political compulsions. I mean, American domestic politics is today a train wreck. They really need to figure out what's happening in their election. They've got too many fronts on which they're firefighting. So in the event of chaos at home, what unites an electorate? The foreign enemy. I mean, we've seen that playbook be used and
many
all
times.
Why should the Americans do any different?
That's a very good point, Maya. That's a good one. Yeah, and especially now that the NATO is now talking about supplying weapons and so on and so forth to Ukraine. But Biden, I mean, not Biden, but Trump, in his previous avatar when he was president, did talk about removing U.S. troops from Ramstein Air Base, and he said let them fight their own battles. So, I mean, you don't know what Trump could, he could do another Kabul in Ukraine for all you know.
Trump could do anything, pretty much anything. But
Yeah,
at this point, I think even I mean, I hate to say it, and I do sincerely hope, and I'll say it over here, that the Democrats managed to convince Joe Biden to step away from the candidacy. But I think that even the Democrats at this point will not want to take on India too much, but at the same time, they need to be able to ensure that their core ideological support base remains intact. Because very much like what we've seen in Indian politics, the liberal opposition has been in disarray. By the same token, the American Democrats are in disarray. And I mean, I come back to the same point that the idea that Russia is enemy number one, soon to be followed by China, not only keeps the sense of American foreign policy and American primacy intact in their own minds, it essentially unites bipartisan support, which is desperately needed right now.
That's a very good point. So whether it is Trump or whether it is Biden or a Democrat, Biden-less Democrats,
let's not forget the 2016 election resulted in a Trump win, but it didn't change the response towards Russia. Yeah.
In fact, Anushka, NATO has for the very first time named and shamed China. It's called it the enabler of the largest war in Europe for its large-scale support for Russia's defense industrial base. It's, New York Times has said that China has helped Russia rebuild its defense industrial base. It's named Chinese front companies which are providing technology to Russia. So this Russia-China axis, are we going to see China, face economic sanctions, that could bar China from global markets? Because China has traditionally been a huge market for high-end cars, luxury goods, and frankly, it was Biden who misread China, Russia when they first started, their trade. He said it's not even a threat. But is it a threat to NATO now, however distant?
Right. Thank you so much, Ms. Gopal. I think the NATO the joint statement of the communique that has come out is really interesting to assess the mood of the NATO countries at the moment and what they are willing to come to a consensus on. Two things stand out for me. One is that the document clearly argues that Russia is the single point most important challenge that NATO countries face today, and that PRC is a definitive enabler of Russia's war in Ukraine, which is what you said, right? And even in the US, the analytical community is divided. On one hand, many agree that the Russia question must be settled and Russia must be put in its place before the China challenge can be addressed. And there is another strand of thought, such as the one that is led by people like Elbridge Colby, who argue that uh, Russia is absolutely not an important challenge in the American foreign policy calculus, and they're missing on the train to compete with China effectively by overstating the emphasis on Russia. And so they should just settle the Russia question as soon as possible, on maybe on terms favoring Russia, and move on to China and focus on that and that alone. And uh, it's important, even in the Indian policy ecosystem, I think, to appreciate just how much a challenge Russia or the Russia-China axis is for the West, because we expect the West to understand just how significant the China challenge is to us. And in that regard, Ambassador Garcetti's remarks do become important, and I listen to them from the core point that I listen to them and deem them as important from the one core point that he said, which is that India-US relations today aren't deep enough to be taken for granted.
Oh, that you can say that,
Yeah.
yes.
And I think that is important, because the foundation of enhancing India-US relations, in my opinion, at the moment, is that we're both finding a mutual challenge in China. And just as India has become a nodal point in US's Indo-Pacific strategy, from the Indian perspective, it's important to have US backing and support, even though trade numbers haven't caught up in the bilateral relationship as much as we would have liked. We are seeing this reinvigorated effort towards military exchanges and technological partnerships. Partially, it's true because India's maybe emerging as a alternative. I won't say speak to viable or not, for American technological companies, but majorly because the US and India face a common challenge in China. And so, in that regard, it becomes important to assess the mood in the US. I would agree with Miss Meerchandani, where she says that whether it be Biden or Trump's, the negative, the sentiment of competition with China, at least, isn't going to go away. On Russia, Trump could uh, either reverse the course, or maybe continue to emphasize defense spending by all NATO countries. But regardless, I think, as much as India wants the West to appreciate our red lines vis-a-vis China, or our friendship with Russia, I think the single most important point of the NATO summit is also something that we should appreciate, which is that they really accord important value to the challenge Russia and China face.
That's very interesting.
On the international.
I'm running out of time, so concluding remarks, Ambassador Fabian, Maya, and Anushka. I actually wanted to bring your attention to the fact that Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, in his congratulatory message to Ajit Doval, our national security advisor for his third reappointment, he actually brought up the India-China border talks, and he said, expressed his readiness to properly handle the ground situation. I mean, I don't know what that even means in the current situation.
Well, let me put it very bluntly. Were I a Chinese diplomat, I would have never agreed to settle the border problem with India. It would be in my interest to keep it boiling from time to time. And that is point number one. Point number two is that you mentioned the message which NSA got, but I don't know whether Prime Minister Narendra Modi got any message from Xi Jinping.
Yeah. Maya, do come in.
So I think, the China problem will remain, but occasionally China will say that, both sides should, follow the instructions of the high leadership and settle the matter. But I think the border problem will remain with us. And what is required is strengthening our military so that we can stand up to China. And to an extent, it is being done.
Okay. All right. That's a good remark. So we basically strengthen our border using Russian and American, armory. Maya, would you like to come in? Can NATO end the war, you think, without sacrificing Ukraine? Think that's going to happen?
I think the short answer is no. It's, I'm a little bit cynical about wars like this. I think they'll fester for a while in some shape, way, or form. I think the irrespective of the immediate catalyst and the expansion, the territorial expansionism, specifically when it comes to Ukraine, I think international relations works in cycles, right? There is always the need for an enemy. There is always the need to keep the war machine going strong. We've spent an hour roughly talking about Russia and Ukraine, and we've not talked about Israel and Palestine at all. That itself should tell us something. So I think I don't want to see this become another Israel-Palestine decades-long festering kind of scenario, but I dare say it might. Because we need it. I mean, we'll be out of a job, frankly, if there's no conflict on the international scale. All four of us here will not know what to talk about. Let's be honest. But I think the truth of the matter is that peace is an ideal, war is the reality, conflict is the reality. Domestic politics across the world tends to direct the source of the conflict or the target of the conflict much more than we actually give credit for, because we were able to create that kind of hype around a particular target or enemy. I mean, I know I'm speaking in abstraction.
Very well put.
I'm
no,
trying.
But it's very well put.
I think human rights and the right to life and dignity, the right to live without fear of having your house and family wiped out, are words. They're nice on paper. I don't know which country stands by them. As far as China is concerned, I think we all saw what happened to global supply chains when the world decided to take on China. It's not so easy. China is another existential threat, not just for a particular geography, but for many geographies around the world. We've seen everything from debt traps to supply chain disruptions to military aggression on our borders. China is operating at different levels in different countries and different geographies, different targets, different strategies. And I think that's really where we're at. We want to be part of the Quad. We want to be part of the Indo-Pacific. We also want to be part of the SCO and sit at the same table as Russia and China.
And BRICS.
Yeah, and BRICS. And I mean, okay, but I think we may need to we may find ourselves in a position where at some point, Nina, we will need to pick a side. We really will need to pick a side. I don't think we can be on all sides all the time.
That's a very interesting point, actually. The good remark. Anushka, you've got exactly 30 seconds.
Right.
Sorry, I ate into your time.
No, but thank you so much, Ms. Gopal, for this very interesting interaction. On the India-China border issue, I'd just like to say this has been a very eventful week for Indian diplomacy and global geopolitics as a whole. We also had the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in Astana, and I think the most interesting thing to watch there, from my perspective, was Jaishankar's meeting with Wang Yi, the Chinese Foreign Minister. And as much as I'd love to be sanguine about it, the fact of the matter is that nothing that came out in the Chinese joint statement from that meeting indicated to us that they're willing to give us any concessions on the border issue, and nothing that was said in our joint statement seemed like something the Chinese would agree to. I mean, you talked about the phrase properly handling the border situation, right? If you read the MEA readout, it states something like the two ministers agreed that the prolongation of the current situation in the border areas is not in the interest of either side. But if the Chinese foreign minister agreed to this, it would mean China slightly shifting its narrative away to actually believing that the border issue is a problem, which it does not, right? Which is why they use vague phrases like properly handling, all the while continuing political communication and high-level dialogue, something that India hasn't been interested in for a while. And so in this regard, I think that's where the real stalemate and the challenge is. And in that regard, I'd agree with Mr. Fabian that the answer is in deterrence. Of course, at Takshashila, we're also conducting a survey to assess public opinion and on what's the best way forward. And if there are any interesting
We'll
remarks.
watch out for that. We'll watch out for that. Thank you very much, Anushka. So this war between the West and Russia, it's a return to the pre-Cold War era, except this is now a hot war, and no one knows where it could lead. So India, as all of you, as Maya Bichandani particularly says, would do well to actually take a side, look at the value, reassess the value of keeping its dependable friend on its side, as in Russia, while making it clear to the United States that its concerns over this security implications that it keeps flagging, about providing arms that, where the technology could be stolen by Russia is something which is a little misplaced. So, so India and Russia are, of course, also diverging on their political realignment. So we'll have to see whether this bear hug is this uncomfortable, awkward bear hug turns into, something that could actually change the dynamics between India and its newest ally, which is the United States. So we'll see how it goes. Thank you very much, Ambassador Fabian. Thank you, Maya Mirchandani. Thank you, Anushka Saxena, for taking part in the show. Viewers, do click on Global Express and please share and tweet.